Hello, sweet sisters of the magical sabbatical. I'm coming to you, as promised, with a little guided audio meditation for you this morning, inspired by my recent travels and me taking really what was one full day to unwind and relax, which was enough. It was enough. I think if you have a good focused day or two where you really unplug and unwind and don't spend too much time in social media and you really give yourself a chance to breathe, that can shift everything. So that one day for me where I really did unplug and unwind, I was sitting and I was watching the waves rolling in, and I was watching the little sea creatures as they traveled by. There's a lot of crabs where I was, and conch, of course, is there. And so I'm watching these little shelled creatures and just kind of enjoying my meditation, and not trying to overthink it too. I was really trying not to make too much meaning of things. Sometimes, and it's funny for people like us who, where everything has meaning, everything is a sign and a symbol, and we read our environment. Sometimes I think we do that to our own detriment. Like it's almost like we can't just relax and let things be and unfold. We're constantly trying to attribute meaning or understanding. And I think that's a hallmark of someone who's evolving spiritually and wants to really see the meaning of life. And we're all seekers. But I do think sometimes we need to stop and try to not overinterpret our environment too, as a means of relaxing and kind of giving our senses a little bit of a break. So anyway, all to say that I was trying not to overinterpret my surroundings, but I kept being struck by how these creatures moved, and I kept asking myself, what are these teachers? If we think of all creatures as really spirit teachers, what is the teaching for these little shelled creatures? What can I learn from them in this moment? And it was so simple and yet so profound. So what I'm offering you here is just something that was helpful to me, a little tool that I used for the rest of the time that I was with my family last week, to remind myself that you can have layers of energetic interaction with your environment. This is the takeaway. It's not all or nothing. It's not, everybody has access to me or nobody has access to me. And one of the things I was realizing was we've kind of oversimplified it in a way, like reducing it down to something almost too simple. When we talk about bubbling up, when you need to do like some kind of protection work, and we talk about imagining yourself in a bubble of light and then mirroring the outside of that bubble so that energy that's coming to you is reflected back to its source. And I still think that's a helpful thing, but it's an all or nothing. It's like you're either in the bubble or you're out of the bubble. But what I was realizing as I was watching these little shelled creatures is I actually think it's much more complex than that. I think you can completely wall off, yourself from other people's energy fields. And so you can look at that as your hard shell, the really hard shell that protects you from anything big that's coming to you. And these creatures, of course, are worried about being prey. So any predators are prevented from, eating these creatures. But then, there are other layers to them, not just the shell, but the exoskeleton, and layers between them and their softest core and the external environment, if that makes sense. So part of what I want you to think about is, yes, there are times where you want to have the big shell and nothing can penetrate the shell. And you can use that as a tool to meditate with. Imagine putting a big wide shell around yourself and pushing every other energy, anybody else's energy, out into the ocean and creating massive distance between your shell and any other energy fields. And you can do that. It's a beautiful meditation, really. And even as I'm saying it to you, like I'm sort of dropping into that. So that can be powerful. But I want you to think about the fact that there are filters, other filters, where you can say this is allowed in, that must stay out. And then thinking about, at the sort of nucleus of who you are, who has access to that softest little innermost part of you, the part that really has no defenses. Who has access to that? And in my opinion, that should be very, very few people who have sort of unmitigated access to you at your innermost. I actually think there's a core, at least for me, and I'm really curious, by the way, to know what you think of all this. I think there's a core for me, part of myself, that I only give access to myself, my high, my living self, my conscious self, my higher self, my guides, and my creator. I mean, there is a part of me literally that no one, I would say not even really my children or my partner, can access. And I think that's probably the softest, most intense core part of myself. And there's still parts of myself that are a mystery to me. So there's probably even at the the micro nucleus of your soul's identity, there's probably even part of you that isn't even accessible to you, so that you can't hurt it. Does that make sense? And so then you macro out from that. So there's that little tiny part of you that's still a mystery to you. There's that next part of you where your sovereignty lives, right? That no one can take from you. And I mean, not even your kids, not your partner, not nothing. And I think that's what a lot of women are missing, honestly, is they're not cultivating that part of themselves that is just for them and just for connecting with spirit guides. And that's, if there's anything you get out of sabbatical this year, truly, like if I could give you a gift, I think it would be cultivating and creating and gestating that part of yourself. Because I think there should be a part of you that cannot be shaken, even by the people you consider to be closest to you in your life. And I think a lot of women don't cultivate that part. And so everybody has access to everything. And so when shit happens, life kind of crumbles. And it's because I think they're not building that core of, who am I? Who am I before I'm anything to anybody else? Does that make sense to you? Who are you before you are anything to anybody else? Who are you before you're a mother, and before you're a partner, and before you're a best friend, and before you're a sister, and before you're a daughter? Who are you before all of that? That part of you should be unshakable and, in my opinion, relatively inaccessible. Then there's the next part of you where it's you plus your core, right? It's you plus your family, you plus your parents, you plus your children, you plus your partner, however you define your kind of innermost circle. Then there's that. But in this model I'm showing you, that's kind of like 3 steps removed from this innermost part of you that I think begins at the level of a mystery and extends out into these concentric circles. So then if you think about what part of you should acquaintances have access to, and then you back that out even more, what part of you should people on Facebook that you don't interact with in your daily life have access to? And you keep seeing how these concentric circles expand, expand, expand. When you manage the amount of influence that people have on the different parts of your identity and your life and your experience of life, I think what you end up doing, there are many positive side effects of that, but I think ultimately what you end up doing is creating a little bit of a shelter for yourself, a little bit of a sanctuary, so that you have access to a peace, P-E-A-C-E. You have access to an inner peace that is unmovable. So I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to imagine whatever shelled creature, whatever crustacean speaks to you. I want you to imagine that you're the essence of your being is in this soft, tender little skin, and that surrounding you is this big, beautiful shell, whether you're imagining yourself as an oyster or a lobster or a crab or a conch, whatever, creature resonates with you. And I want you to imagine that that big, beautiful shell, at any time you have access to that protection. So even if today, if you feel like you need it today, you can just imagine touching and feeling that shell around yourself and feeling how it protects you and keeps you safe, even prevents water from reaching you in many parts, in many cases. Then I want you to feel a step back from that, the little creature that you are. You have probably another layer of shell or skeleton before you even reach your outer shell. So I want you to notice that layer of protection around you. And set an intention right now in this moment. Who has access to that? Not quite the most intimate access to you, not unfettered access to you, but a little bit of filtering. Who's in that category? And just set the intention that anyone who you give access to at that medium level between extreme protection and no protection, just in your mind's eye, just grant that access. Think about who that is, set an intention for that. And guides and guardian angels, we call upon you this morning as my sisters and I, work on this shell meditation together. Help us to know, guides and guardian spirits, that we are always safe and always protected. And help us to use the gift of discernment to know who should be interacting with us on these different levels. And guides, we ask that as we enter this season of growth, when all of us are beginning to open our arms and extend our work out into the world, we ask for guidance and wisdom, discernment and protection, safety and understanding, clarity and connection. Especially the women in this circle, guides, we understand very well that the greatest gift we have is our connection to God, to the divine, to our Creator, and that all wisdom truly that comes from that place will thrive. So we appreciate that connection. We cherish that connection. We're so grateful for the understanding that you offer us as we connect with intention to you. We ask for a deep sense of purpose, and we ask for clear messages about how to step into that purpose. And as we begin to move as these tender little creatures we've been in our big shells now for the whole season of winter, so we're starting to just stretch our arms and stretch our legs. And I think that's why this meditation for me was so profound for this particular moment in time. It was so right, because this is exactly what we're doing. All of us, you're doing it too. Even if you're not conscious of it, you are beginning to kind of stretch arms and legs and figure out how to take what you learned in the wintertime and bring it into being. Create matter out of energy, out of form in your mind. And we're so thankful for the guidance, the protection, the wisdom. And then I want you to now turn your attention to that soft little unprotected creature that lives within that shell. I want you to notice all of the edges of that soft body of yours inside. This is a metaphor, of course, but I'm asking you to imagine as your most kind of naked, fleshy, unprotected self. I want you to take a moment to connect with her, send her love and healing. If there's any little places in her soft body that have been hurt or injured, just sending love and understanding and connection to those soft places. And I think this is part of the secret, you guys. I think, a lot of us lose that softness, either because we've been hurt, or we've been abused, or we have, been told not to be that vulnerable to anyone. And like I said, I do think there's a part of you that should only be vulnerable to you. And I think that's a part of when people say, well, what does it mean, to be a goddess or whatever? And I think they're half joking about it. But to me, there's something serious about a woman who acknowledges that she doesn't have to be all things to all people, and that in fact there's a great part of her that's still mysterious, and she's going to cultivate that aspect of herself. And I think it is part of the secret of how do you become a deeply spiritual woman with good boundaries, is doing exactly what we're talking about here. And also keeping in mind too, when you feel like you have to fix everything for everybody, don't judge yourself, but notice that reaction, because that's actually more ego than it is spirit. When you look around and say, oh, I could be helping all these people, it's like, well, but that's not what you're here for. You're actually here to evolve yourself. And oftentimes the most help you give to people is by living your authenticity and moving on your path and letting them see you. The passive teaching is often the most profound teaching, in my opinion. I think a lot of times when we see someone and we think they can help us, we put them on a pedestal, like, oh, she's going to fix everything. And then when they don't, we knock them off the pedestal. But that's not fair. That's not fair to the person it happens to, and it's not fair to the person who's experiencing those expectations. So I think the best thing we can do for each other is remember that our greatest teaching as healers is often the way we live by example, because you can tell much more from someone's actions than you can from their words in many cases, although in some cases their actions are their words. I like to watch people, and I like to watch, and I like to not jump in too early. What I have found is people will often solve their own problems if you give them enough time, and people will also create their own problems if you give them enough time. And both of those are learning opportunities. I mean, it's a shitty thing to say in a way that I like to watch people create their own problems. I'm not necessarily saying that, but I do think that people, you can watch them wind themselves up and into these circumstances, and then they're learning, but then they're frustrated, and then they're projecting. Like, you can watch the whole cycle unfold. So if you actually stop intervening so much in people's lives around you, and start observing, it's a very powerful experience, and you can learn as much from watching people as you can from intervening. And certainly people learn more from solving their own problems than from having their problems solved. It's sort of like parenting in a way. And I think there's a time to jump in. I think there does come a time where people need help, and it's okay to jump in and provide that help. But I think in general, practicing that neutrality that I talk about in Pillars of Priestessing is really, really important. And I think you'll find as you get older that there are just more and more opportunities to do that. And so you have to decide when and how to practice it well. So just sending one last little beam of love and light and acceptance and appreciation to that softest part of you, and just promising her, she is safe, she is held, she doesn't need to worry. You are monitoring who has access to her, and so you are a good guardian of that tender part of yourself. And always remind her she doesn't have to be afraid. It's fear is the most unproductive emotion we can feel, except when it saves your life. But sustained ongoing fear, like a constant paranoia and fear, it doesn't serve you. So just let her trust, let her kind of rest in that knowing that she's held and taken care of, and then extending back out to that softer skeleton, back out to that harder shell, and really letting yourself feel that sense of retreat that I think those creatures enjoy by moving into that shell and knowing and trusting that they are held in that container. And then take that back out into the world and let that be a teaching. Again, you don't even have to say anything. Let it be a teaching by example. That when people say, well, gosh, how do you move with grace in the world, or how do you not let things get to you so much? And it's like, well, it's quite complex, and we're all learning that. In fact, I think it's a layered effect of what reaches you and what doesn't reach you. And I think in every moment, as with everything in life, you have a choice about how you experience your interactions with your environment. So that may be the quote of the day. You have a choice in every moment of how you experience your interactions with your environment. Almost as good a quote as well, we've had many good quotes along the way, but I think that might be the one for today. And the other one that I really love is people are constantly interacting with you at their level of development, not yours. So when you go into interactions with people and you're expecting them to interact with you at your level of development, that's actually your fault, not theirs. So your first job, and I learned this as a teacher, but you can learn it as a therapist or in any context. Your first job really when you're trying to interact with people is to understand as much about them as you can. Because the more you know about where they're coming from, the more you're going to be able to anticipate what they need and be able to really be an effective provider of care or help or education or whatever you're doing. But your goal should be to really understand where people are coming from. It'll lead to far less frustration on your part and a lot more productive encounters between you, for sure. Aho. All right, my sisters. Well, I send you back to the sea with your beautiful layers of protection intact. Always know that you are safe and held. And most importantly, always remind that tender part of yourself that she is safe and held. I think as women, one of the things we need to learn and help each other remember more than anything, it's not so much learning, it's remembering, is we keep each other safe. We keep ourselves safe. We don't necessarily have to look out into the world and try and find safety and protection elsewhere. It's always within our reach. And so monitoring that narrative closely about how do you, what makes you feel safe, and do you externalize your sense of safety, or do you internalize it and recognize that you're always safe and well. And I think if we could really see, all the spirit guides and angelic beings and spirits who surround us all the time, I think we would understand this, not just know it, but understand it on a different level. So there's that. Many blessings, my sisters. I will see you very, very soon. May you be well and protected and safe always. Aho.